She was born surrounded by luxury, diamonds, and power. But what no one knew is that brilliant empire was built on blood. In a possession surrounded by golden walls, a young man tries to escape his own surname, while the man sworn to her destruction ends up becoming the only one capable of saving her. This is the story of Thando Mthembu, the princess of a criminal empire, who dared to fall in love with the enemy. The rain hammered against the armored windows of the Mthembu mansion in Sandton, Johannesburg's most opulent neighborhood, where mirrored skyscrapers reflected not only wealth, but also the dark secrets that sustained that empire. Thando Mthembu watched the raindrops slide down the glass, each carrying fragments of a life she had never chosen, but which was irrevocably bound like invisible chains to her wrists. At 23, she was the most precious jewel of the Mthembu family, a dynasty that had built its fortune through decades of control over the South African criminal underworld, from illegal diamond trafficking to money laundering that flowed like underground rivers through the veins of the national economy. Her father, Bongani Mthembu, was known on the streets of Soweto and in the glass towers of Sandton as Unkosi, the king, a man whose word was absolute law among the criminal syndicates that operated from Cape Town to Durban. His hands were stained with the blood of dozens, perhaps hundreds, who dared to defy him or were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thando had grown up sheltered from this brutal reality, educated in the best private schools, sent to study in London, but always under the constant watch of bodyguards who were more jailers than protectors. She knew that her beauty, skin the color of polished ebony, almond-shaped eyes that seemed to hold storms, hair braided in intricate patterns that told ancient stories, was both her blessing and her curse. That particular night marked the anniversary of his mother Nomsa's death, a gentle woman who had been devoured by the violence of that world 5 years earlier. Thando still remembered the sound of gunshots echoing through the house, the smell of gunpowder mixed with his mother's French perfume, the deafening silence that followed. The murder was never officially solved, but everyone knew it was a message from a rival organization, the Nkosi Brothers Syndicate, which controlled the arms trafficking routes from the port of Durban. Since then, Bongani had become even more ruthless, expanding his empire with a methodical cruelty that made even the most hardened criminals tremble. Thando descended the Italian marble stairs of the mansion, her bare feet almost silent against the cold, polished stone. The house was strangely quiet for a property that normally teemed with security guards, employees, and members of her father's organization in constant meetings. She knew he was in his office, the sanctuary where the darkest dealings were conducted, where agreements were sealed with handshakes worth more than any signed contract, and betrayals were punished with a death sentence carried out before dawn. In the kitchen, she found Zanele, the housekeeper who had worked for the family for over 20 years, a middle-aged Zulu woman whose face bore the marks of time and worry. Zanele had been like a second mother to Thando, especially after Nomsa's death, offering comfort in the darkest moments when no one else dared to approach. Sawubona, Ntombazane, Zanele murmured in Zulu, calling her girl with a tenderness that contrasted with the harshness of the environment. Thando embraced the older woman, inhaling the familiar scent of spices and soap that always calmed her. She would be proud of you, Zanele whispered, cupping Thando's face in her calloused hands. Your mother always wanted you to be free, to live far from all this. The words hung in the air like an impossible promise, because they both knew there was no freedom for someone born in the heart of darkness. Thando was betrothed to Sandile Khumalo, heir to another powerful criminal family that controlled the construction mafia in Johannesburg, an arrangement made by her father to consolidate power and territory. The wedding was scheduled for 3 months from now, a date that loomed like a guillotine about to fall upon her freedom. It was then that she first heard about Ayize Dlamini, the name whispered by the servants, a ghost haunting the secret conversations between her father's men. Ayize was a detective in the South African Police's organized crime unit, known for his tireless determination to dismantle the criminal networks that were strangling the country. But there was something else Thando had picked up on in the fragments of conversations. Her father feared him, not just as an adversary, but as someone who possessed information that could completely destroy the Mthembu empire. Thando's obsession began innocently enough, with discreet internet searches using encrypted connections she had learned from hackers paid by her father. She discovered photos of Ayize, a 30-year-old man with intense eyes that seemed to see through lies, short hair, a scar that cut across his left eyebrow, telling stories of battles fought in the streets. He came from Khayelitsha, one of the most dangerous townships near Cape Town, where he had grown up witnessing the violence of gangs that controlled every corner, every establishment through extortion and terror. Ayize had lost his younger sister, Naledi, when she was only 15 years old, a victim of human trafficking controlled by syndicates that sold her across borders. That tragedy had transformed him from a young man without prospects into a man with a singular mission: to destroy the criminal organizations that destroyed innocent lives every day. He had studied law, working during the day and attending night classes, joined the police force at 22, and quickly rose through the ranks through courage bordering on recklessness and a sharp intelligence that unraveled complex money laundering schemes and criminal operations. Thando knew she was playing with fire, but something inside her, perhaps the same rebelliousness her mother had always tried to suppress for fear of the consequences, compelled her to find out more. She began frequenting places where she knew he might be: discreet cafes in Braamfontein where police officers and lawyers met, bookstores in Melville where he supposedly spent hours studying old cases. It was on one of these forays, 3 weeks after beginning her dangerous search, that their worlds finally collided inevitably. The coffee shop, The Corner in Newtown, was a modest establishment that contrasted sharply with the upscale restaurants Thando usually frequented. She entered dressed simply, jeans and a t-shirt, her hair hidden under a scarf, sunglasses even in the dimly lit room. But Ayize recognized her immediately, his trained eyes identifying Bongani Mthembu's daughter, even in her amateurish disguise. He approached her table with measured steps, the tension visible in every muscle of his body. "You're very far from Sandton, Thando Mthembu," he said, his deep voice carrying an accent that betrayed his township origins. Her name on his lips sounded like both an accusation and a caress. Thando removed his sunglasses, meeting her gaze with a courage she didn't know she possessed. "And you're exactly where I expected you to be, Detective Dlamini," she replied, her voice firm despite the racing heart that threatened to burst in her chest. That first encounter was charged with an electric tension that neither of them could fully explain. Ayize should have ignored it, or better yet, used that opportunity to question her about her father's operations. But there was something in her eyes, a deep sadness, a silent desperation for freedom, that resonated with her own unhealed wounds. They talked for hours that afternoon, a dangerous dance where every word was measured, every partial revelation could be a trap or a bridge between two worlds that should never touch. Thando spoke about his mother, about the arranged marriage that loomed like a life sentence, about his feeling of being a chess piece moved by blood-stained hands. Ayize, in turn, shared her grief over the loss of Naledi, her determination to dismantle the networks that destroyed families, her loneliness of being an honest man in a corrupt system where even superiors were bought by the same criminals he was trying to imprison. When they finally parted ways, they both knew they had crossed an invisible but definitive line. Thando returned to the Mthembu mansion with conflicting feelings ravaging her insides: guilt for betraying her family, even if only in thought, excitement at finally meeting someone who saw her as a person and not as property, fear of the consequences if her father found out. Ayize drove back to her modest apartment in Hillbrow, a rundown neighborhood where violence was as common as dawn, questioning her own sanity for allowing any kind of connection with the daughter of the man he swore to destroy. But fate, or perhaps something darker and more inevitable, conspired to intertwine their paths in increasingly complex and dangerous ways. Ayize's investigation into the Mthembu organization was reaching a critical point. He had managed to infiltrate an informant, a man named Mandla, who worked in the accounting departments of shell companies used to launder money. Mandla had promised documents that would directly link Bongani to murders, international trafficking, and corruption that reached even government ministers. The meeting to receive the documents was scheduled for a week after Ayize's encounter with Thando, in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Alexandra, another township where the law rarely ventured. Ayize arrived early, checking every shadow, every potential exit, her gun loaded and her intuition on high alert. But Mandla never showed up. Her body was found 3 days later floating in the Hartbeespoort Dam reservoir, tortured in ways that served as a brutal warning to anyone who considered treason. Thando learned of Mandla's death through whispered conversations between her father's security guards. She saw the satisfied smile on Bongani's face during dinner that night, the way he cut her meat with precise movements reminiscent of other, more sinister actions. That night, while the house slept, she sent an anonymous message to Ayize through an encrypted app she had tracked. They knew. Someone inside your unit warned them. Be careful. That message saved Ayize's life. He discovered the next day that his own captain, a man named Thabo, whom he respected, had been on Bongani's payroll for years, receiving monthly deposits into offshore accounts in exchange for information about investigations and police operations. The revelation devastated Ayize, confirming his worst suspicions about the depth of corruption that allowed men like Bongani Mthembu to operate with near-total impunity. He traced the message's origin, his contacts in technology departments working feverishly, until he identified the IP address coming from the Mthembu mansion. The only possible explanation was Thando, which meant she was risking herself in unimaginable ways to protect him. The awareness of this reality fundamentally changed something within Ayize. She was no longer just the daughter of her enemy, but a prisoner seeking liberation, a soul trapped in darkness trying to reach the light. They began communicating through these secret channels, coded messages that gradually evolved from tactical information to emotional confessions. Thando revealed details about his father's operations that Ayize could never uncover through conventional investigation. Names of corrupt politicians, details of arms shipments from West African countries, locations of safe houses where money and drugs were stored. In return, Ayize offered her something more precious, hope that one day she could escape, that there was a world beyond the gilded walls of her luxurious prison. The risk of their clandestine meetings increased with each passing week. They met in different locations each time. A crowded market in Yeoville where they could lose themselves in the throng. A remote lookout point in the hills outside the city where only couples seeking privacy ventured. Once even in an abandoned church in Soweto where the peeling walls silently bore witness to their impossible relationship. Each encounter deepened the connection between them, transforming initial fascination into something far more dangerous and overwhelming. It was during one of these encounters, 2 weeks before Thando's wedding to Sandile Khumalo, that Ayize finally kissed her. They were in his car parked in a deserted industrial area, the rain creating curtains of water that isolated them from the rest of the world. "This is madness," Ayize whispered against his lips, even as his hands caressed her face with a tenderness that contrasted with the hardness he usually projected. "Then go mad with me," Thando replied, pulling him closer, losing himself in the intensity of that moment stolen from fate. But reality always exacts its price, especially when one is toying with forces as dark as those that surrounded them. Sandile Khumalo was not merely an arranged fiancé. He was a man obsessed with the idea of possessing Thando, fascinated not only by her beauty, but by the power she represented as a bridge between Johannesburg's two most powerful crime families. When rumors began to circulate about Thando's suspicious meetings, strange behavior, and unexplained absences, he decided to place his own surveillance network upon her. Sandile's men were professionals, ex-military men trained in surveillance techniques that made them impossible to detect. They followed Thando for 2 weeks, documenting her every move, every deviation from her normal routine. And finally, inevitably, they captured photos of her and Ayize together, granoline but unmistakable images of kisses, embraces, the kind of intimacy that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. Sandile took the photos directly to Bongani Mthembu on a Thursday afternoon, 15 days before the wedding. The explosion of fury that followed made even the most hardened men in the organization recoil in fear. Bongani was not a man of emotional displays. His violence was calculated, cold, and all the more terrifying precisely because of its methodical nature. But his daughter's betrayal, especially with a policeman dedicated to destroying him, struck something primal within him. Thando was summoned to her father's office, the same place where men had pleaded for their lives before being dragged to terrible fates. She entered with her chin held high, refusing to show the terror gnawing at her insides. The photos were scattered across the mahogany desk, evidence condemning her for betrayal not only of her family, but of her organization. "Explain," was all Bongani said, his low voice more menacing than any scream could be. Thando didn't deny it, didn't invent pathetic excuses that would only insult her father's intelligence. "I love him," she said simply, each word a bullet fired against the expectations and traditions that had imprisoned her entire life. "He's a policeman. He wants to destroy me. And you choose him?" The disbelief and fury in Bongani's voice made the air seem electrified. "I choose freedom," Thando replied, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I choose a life not built on blood and terror. I choose to be human, not a pawn in their power games." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Sandile watched from the doorway, his cold eyes calculating, already planning revenge for having been humiliated in this way. He was the one who finally spoke. "Let me deal with the policeman, in a way that serves as a permanent lesson about the consequences of disrespecting our family." Bongani's nodding of approval was Ayize's death sentence. Thando was locked in her room under constant guard, her phone confiscated, all connections to the outside world cut off. But Zanele, the loyal housekeeper who had raised her, risked her own life to pass a disposable phone through the window in the middle of the night. With trembling hands, Thando managed to send a final message to Ayize. "They know everything. They're going to kill you. Run, please." Ayize received the message while in his apartment, reviewing documents for a different case. He knew that fleeing was the logical choice, the action any rational person would take upon learning that South Africa's most dangerous mafia had marked him for execution. But Ayize wasn't guided solely by logic. He was driven by a sense of justice bordering on suicidal stubbornness, and now also by the impossible love that had blossomed in the most adverse circumstances. Instead of fleeing, he summoned the only allies he could still trust, a small group of detectives who shared his vision of a country free from endemic corruption. Lerato, a tough Sotho woman who had grown up in Soweto and bore bullet scars to prove her courage. Bulelani, a giant Xhosa whose family had been destroyed by construction gangs. And Jabu, a tech expert who could hack into systems considered impenetrable. "This will cost us everything. Our jobs, maybe our lives," Ayize told them as they gathered in her apartment that night, the lights of Johannesburg flickering through the window like watching eyes. "But if we can gather enough evidence and survive to present it, we can bring down not only Bongani Mthembu but the entire network of corruption that allows men like him to exist." The three agreed without hesitation, united by shared experiences of loss and a stubborn idealism that refused to die despite all the evidence suggesting they should give up. The plan they developed was audacious to the point of insanity: to break into one of the Mthembu organization's safe houses, the same one where Thando had revealed that compromising physical documents were kept as insurance against internal betrayals. Bongani was old school in some respects. He didn't fully trust digital systems that could be hacked, preferring to have physical copies of contracts, payment records, and compromising photos of politicians and judges on his payroll. The safe house was located in Observatory, a middle-class neighborhood where a discreet property wouldn't attract attention. Jabu hacked the security system in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, creating a loop in the cameras that would give the team exactly 17 minutes to enter, locate the documents, and leave before the system reset and alerted the security guards. Lerato and Bulelani procured illegal weapons through contacts in the townships, prepared for the inevitable confrontation should anything go wrong. But Sandile Khumalo was also planning, his own network of informants within the police eventually picking up rumors about Ayize's operation. He saw this not as a threat, but as the perfect opportunity to allow Ayize to break into the safe house, obtain the documents, and then ambush him in an isolated location where he and his small group would be eliminated along with all the evidence. In this way, Sandile would solve multiple problems simultaneously: eliminate the threat of Ayize, recover the incriminating documents, and demonstrate his worth to Bongani, solidifying his position in the criminal hierarchy. The break-in went exactly as planned for the first 12 minutes. Ayize and her team entered through the back door, which Jabu had unlocked electronically, moved silently through the dark corridors, and located the safe hidden behind a false panel in the library. Bulelani used a small amount of plastic explosives to open the safe without causing an audible explosion, only the dull pop of metal giving way under controlled pressure. Inside were folders and folders of documents that validated every suspicion Ayize had harbored for years. Assassination contracts with signatures, bank records of offshore accounts directly linking to Bongani, photos of secret meetings between criminal leaders and government ministers, even videos on flash drives showing executions ordered by Bongani personally. It was enough evidence to completely destroy the Mthembu organization and cause a political earthquake that would reach the highest levels of the South African government. They had 63 seconds left when they exited through the same back door, carrying 2 heavy backpacks filled with documents and digital devices. That's when the lights came on, momentarily blinding them, and voices shouting, "Police! On the ground!" echoed from all directions. But Ayize recognized some of the faces. They weren't real police officers. They were mercenaries hired by the Khumalo organization, dressed in fake tactical vests to create confusion should witnesses report the incident. The ensuing shootout was chaotic and brutal. Lerato was hit in the first exchange of gunfire, a bullet piercing her shoulder, but she continued firing with her other hand, her determination unwavering even as blood stained her shirt. Bulelani used his immense body as a shield, allowing Ayize and Jabu to retreat for cover behind a concrete wall. The night exploded with gunfire that certainly drew unwanted attention from the entire neighborhood. Ayize made a split-second decision. He handed one of the backpacks to Jabu and shouted, "Run! Take this to the press, to international organizations, to anyone who might use it." Jabu hesitated only a moment before disappearing into the darkness, his lean, swift silhouette vanishing among the houses as bullets ripped through the air where he had been seconds before. Ayize and Bulelani covered his escape, firing with calculated effort to keep the attackers at bay, while Lerato crawled into a better position despite his wound. Sirens finally cut through the night, real police officers this time, responding to multiple calls from terrified residents. The mercenaries retreated quickly, disappearing before they could be identified, leaving only empty cartridges and bloodstains as evidence of the confrontation. Ayize and his team were detained naturally, arrested for trespassing and illegal possession of weapons, their protests about who they really were ignored by police officers, who only saw criminals caught in the crossfire. As Ayize was shoved into a police car, his head roughly pressed down, he locked eyes with a man watching from a black car parked on the street. Sandile Kumalo, his face a mask of controlled fury as he realized half the documents had escaped. That look conveyed a silent promise. This was far from over. At the Mthembu mansion, Thando sensed a shift in the atmosphere, a disturbance like electricity before a storm. Zanele whispered news through the locked door. There had been a shootout. Ayize had been arrested, but some of the documents had disappeared overnight. Thando's heart wavered between terror for his fate and desperate hope that perhaps, just perhaps, that evidence could initiate the destruction of the empire that had imprisoned him his entire life. Bongani called an emergency meeting with his most trusted lieutenants, including Sandile. The room echoed with anger and accusations as they discussed how to contain the damage, how to recover the missing documents before they could be released. His daughter knows too much, Sandile said, his voice cold and calculated. She was the source of the information. As long as she breathes, we are vulnerable. The silence that followed his words was heavy with terrible implications. Bongani looked at the door leading to the upper floor, where Thando was confined. For the first time in his brutal life, he faced a dilemma that tested even his legendary cruelty. His own daughter, his only surviving child from Namsa, was now being considered a liability that needed to be eliminated. "She is my blood," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion he rarely displayed. "As long as there are alternatives, she remains alive. But if the documents are published, if our organization is completely exposed..." He didn't finish the sentence, but everyone understood the implication. Jabu worked feverishly in a hideout Ayize kept for emergencies, a tiny room above a mechanic's shop in Hillbrow. He scanned every document, every photo, organizing everything into files that he simultaneously sent to 5 different investigative journalists, 2 international human rights organizations, and even to the office of the new president who had promised to fight corruption. But Jabu knew that scanning and distributing wasn't enough. In a country where judges were bought and journalists were silenced, they needed something more dramatic to ensure the story couldn't be suppressed. He decided to broadcast live on social media, exposing the documents in real time to millions of South Africans. At 9 o'clock on a Wednesday evening, exactly 36 hours after the raid on the safe house, Jabu began the broadcast that would change everything. With his face partially hidden but his voice clear and firm, he began to reveal names, show photos, read excerpts from damning contracts, and display evidence of corruption that reached the highest levels of government. The broadcast went viral within minutes. Millions watched as Jabu systematically dismantled the facade of respectability that criminals like Bongani Mthembu had built up over decades. He named specific politicians, specific judges, specific police commanders, all on the Mthembu organization's payroll. Social media exploded with outrage, hashtags demanding justice trending instantly, protests beginning to form in the streets even before the broadcast ended. At the police station where Ayize was being held, corrupt officers desperately tried to isolate him, but others, those not yet tainted by systemic corruption, began to question why a decorated detective was being treated like a common criminal. Jabu's broadcast had included context about who Ayize was, his investigation, and the conspiracy to silence him. Growing public pressure forced his release just 2 hours after the broadcast began, commanders fearing that detaining him any longer would only confirm each accusation being made publicly. Bongani watched the broadcast with an increasingly grim expression, his jaw clenched as he saw his empire dissected before the entire world. He knew arrests would come, perhaps not immediately, as his lawyers were the best money could buy, but eventually the pressure would be too great even for the corrupt system to ignore. His first action was to protect assets, transfer money to untraceable accounts, and destroy any physical evidence still under his control. His second action was more personal and far darker. He climbed the stairs to Thando's room, dismissing the guards with a gesture. Father and daughter stared at each other across the space that seemed to have expanded into an insurmountable abyss. "You destroyed everything," Bongani said, her voice lacking the anger she expected, only a deep, bitter weariness. "I built this empire for you, to ensure you would never know poverty, never be vulnerable like I was growing up on the streets of Soweto." "You built a prison," Thando replied, his own voice laden with emotions too complex to name. "A gilded prison is still a prison, and every brick was cemented with the blood of innocent people like Mom." The mention of Namsa visibly struck Bongani, his defenses cracking for a moment. "Your mother understood the necessities of power," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. "My mother died because of your power," Thando countered, tears finally breaking through his composure. "And if you kill me too, It will only prove that there was never any real love in this family, only transactions and property. Bongani recoiled as if he had been physically struck. For a long moment, the most feared man in Johannesburg seemed only old and exhausted. "Go," he said finally, turning toward the door. "Take what you can carry and disappear. But understand this. When you walk out that door, you are no longer my daughter, and I can't protect you from the others who want revenge for what your police officer boyfriend did." And it was the closest thing to mercy Bongani Mthembu was capable of offering, and they both knew it. Thando didn't waste the impossible opportunity she was given. With Zanelli's help, she gathered hidden money, essential documents, and escaped via the same service route she had used as a child to explore the world beyond the mansion gates. The night city swallowed her up, a refugee of her own surname, pursued by forces that would not easily accept the public humiliation they had suffered. Ayize found her at a cheap motel in Yeovil, the kind of place where no one asked questions as long as you paid in cash. When he opened the door and saw her there, emotionally wounded but physically free, something inside him that had been tense for weeks finally relaxed. They embraced without words, communicating through touch everything they couldn't express verbally: fear, relief, love that had survived impossibilities. But reality didn't allow for prolonged moments of tenderness. Sandile Kumalo had put a price on both their heads, using criminal channels that operated beyond any law. Professional assassins, some from neighboring countries like Mozambique and Zimbabwe, began to hunt them systematically. Ayize used every resource, every contact, every trick learned in years on the streets and in the police force to keep them one step ahead. Lorado, recovering from her shoulder injury, became her most crucial ally. She used her network of informants in the townships to track the hunters' movements, provide temporary safe houses, and obtain weapons and supplies. Bulelani, in turn, physically confronted some of the less experienced assassins, sending brutal messages back through the criminal networks. Killing Ayize and Thando wouldn't be as easy as hiring someone. For 2 weeks, they lived like ghosts, changing locations each night, sleeping in shifts, always waiting for the knock on the door that would mean they had been found. It was during this period of extreme tension that Thando and Ayize truly got to know each other, beyond the dramatic circumstances that initially brought them together. They shared stories of childhoods in opposite worlds, hers in empty luxury, his in poverty that forged steely determination. Thando revealed dreams he had never been able to pursue: studying social work, working with children in the townships, using resources he inherited from his mother to build something positive instead of destroying. Ayize spoke of his sister Naledi, how she loved to dance, how her laughter could light up the miserable shack where they grew up. He admitted that his pursuit of justice was sometimes consumed by vengeance, that he needed to find balance so as not to become as dark as those he hunted. "You make me want to be better," Ayize confessed one night, while they were in a safe apartment in Soweto, the city lights scattered below like fallen stars. "You remind me that there are things worth protecting, not just destroying." Thando kissed him softly, a gesture that held promise and hope despite the darkness surrounding them. The situation began to change when public pressure forced government action. The president, facing massive protests and international coverage of the scandal revealed by Jabu, had no choice but to order high-level arrests. Bongani Mthembu was finally arrested in a spectacular operation involving elite police units, his mansion surrounded before dawn on a Sunday. Images of him being led away in handcuffs were broadcast globally, the powerful Nkosi finally fallen. But even imprisoned, his influence did not disappear completely. Lawyers immediately began working on his defense, claiming that the evidence was obtained illegally, that there were procedural issues, buying time while they planned longer-term strategies. Sandile Kumalo was smarter. Realizing that the tide had decisively turned against the old regime, he began negotiating immunity in exchange for testimony against other members of the criminal network, including Bongani. It was classic betrayal, but also calculated survival from someone who understood when to switch sides. His willingness to cooperate meant that the price on Ayize and Thando's heads was discreetly removed. Killing the people who exposed the corruption would only bring more unwanted attention. 3 months after Jabu's transmission that triggered everything, Ayize and Thando were finally able to stop running. They rented a modest apartment in Melville, a bohemian neighborhood where the mix of cultures and histories allowed them to go unnoticed. It wasn't the kind of luxury Thando had known, but it had something infinitely more precious: genuine freedom. Ayize returned to police work, albeit in a new unit created specifically to combat systemic corruption, free from the contamination that had destroyed previous departments. He became a public figure, a symbol of integrity in a country desperate for heroes untainted by corrupt compromises. Thando began studying, finally pursuing the education he had always desired. preparing for work that would give meaning to his life beyond the surname he carried. The trial of Thando Mthembu became a national sensation, lasting months as prosecutors presented a mountain of evidence accumulated over years, but finally usable thanks to the exposed documents. Thando did not attend the court sessions in person, but he read every report, every revelation about the full extent of his father's operations. It was painful to confront the complete reality of who he was, what he had done, but also necessary for his own healing. The verdict came on a cloudy August afternoon, guilty on 17 counts of murder, 23 counts of trafficking, and countless counts of corruption and money laundering. Bongani was sentenced to multiple life sentences, ensuring he would spend the rest of his days behind bars. When the verdict was read, Thando was in his social psychology class, trying to focus on theories of human behavior while his phone constantly vibrated with news notifications. She visited him once, 6 months after his arrest. The maximum security prison in Pretoria was cold and desolate, so different from the mansion where he had reigned. Bongani seemed to have aged decades, his hair completely gray now, shoulders hunched under the weight of fate that had finally caught up with him. They sat through a glass partition, communicating through telephones that distorted their voices. "You look fine," Bongani said finally, and there was genuine surprise in his tone. "I'm free," Thando replied simply. "For the first time in my life, I don't wake up afraid of being a bargaining chip in someone else's power games." Bongani nodded slowly, perhaps finally understanding something he had been blind to all his life. "Your mother would have been proud," he said, and there was a break in his voice that revealed the man behind the monster he had become. "Of you, not of me. She always knew I was lost, but she had hope for you." Those were the closest words to redemption Thando Mthembu would offer, and Thando accepted them for what they were, a belated acknowledgement of truths that had cost so many lives to learn. She never visited him again after that day, not out of cruelty, but because they both understood that some chapters need to end completely so that new ones can begin. Thando focused on building a life that honored his mother's memory. He established a foundation using money he had legally inherited, dedicated to rescuing children from human trafficking networks, offering them opportunities that Naledi, Ayize's sister, never had. Ayize worked tirelessly to dismantle remaining criminal networks, but now with appropriate institutional support instead of operating in the shadows. He testified in dozens of trials, his credibility helping to convict corrupt figures at all levels of government and society. But at night, he would return to his apartment in Melville where Thando awaited him, and there they would build something they both thought impossible: normalcy. 18 months after escaping for their lives, they married in a simple ceremony. It wasn't the grand event that Thando's arranged marriage to Sandile would have been, just close friends including Lerato and Bulalani, who survived the battles alongside them, and Zanele, who risked everything to protect the girl she raised. Jabu served as Ayize's best man, his technological courage being a direct reason for them all being alive and free. The ceremony took place in a small church in Soweto, the same one where Ayize's grandmother had prayed for decades, believing against all evidence that her grandchildren would find a better path than the streets offered. When Ayize and Thando exchanged vows, they didn't repeat traditional words but promises forged in their unique experiences. They vowed never to use power to oppress, always to remember where they came from and who helped them along the way, to build a legacy based on justice instead of fear. The South Africa that emerged from the scandals was different, still imperfect but perhaps slightly more honest about its wounds. Reforms were implemented in the police and the judiciary, and anti-corruption measures were strengthened under pressure from a population that finally demanded real change. But Ayize and Thando knew that progress was fragile, that dark forces only retreated temporarily, waiting for an opportunity to resurface in new forms. 2 years after their marriage, Thando gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Naledi Ayize Dlamini, honoring the memories of Ayize's lost sister and Thando's mother, women whose lives were cut short by worldly violence they couldn't control. When Ayize held her daughter for the first time, tears streamed silently down her face, tears for all that had been lost, but also for the hope that this small, perfect life represented. Thando watched her husband and daughter, her heart overflowing with complex emotions. She thought of her own childhood in a gilded cage, determined to ensure that Naledi would know freedom from her very first breath. The journey from a mansion in Sandton to a modest apartment in Melville had been not just a geographical change, but a fundamental transformation of soul. In the following years, Ayize continued to rise through the ranks of the revamped police force, eventually leading the National Organized Crime Department. His reputation for incorruptibility became legendary, with young recruits studying his methods and drawing inspiration from his story. He never forgot where he came from, regularly returning to Khayelitsha to speak with young people about alternatives to the violence that consumed so many lives in the townships. Thando expanded her foundation, establishing support centers in 5 major cities. She worked directly with victims, her own experience of gilded captivity giving her a unique perspective on different forms of captivity. The stories of the children she rescued echoed her own, trapped by circumstances beyond their control, deserving a chance to write different endings to their narratives. Occasionally, Thando still had nightmares about the sound of gunshots that killed her mother, about weeks running for their lives, about looking into her father's eyes when he finally let her go. But Ayize was always there to hold her when she woke up gasping in the darkness, reminding her that they had survived, that they were building something beautiful from the ashes of devastated pasts. Sandile Khumalo, true to his survivor nature, rebuilt himself in a different role. His testimony had helped convict dozens, and in return he received a reduced sentence that freed him after only 3 years. He emerged from prison claiming transformation, establishing legitimate businesses in construction, ironically the same sector that the construction mafia once dominated through extortion. Ayize monitored him closely, skeptical of sudden redemptions from men who had built careers on violence and manipulation. But Sandile never approached Thando again or sought revenge. Perhaps he finally understood that some battles weren't worth the cost, or perhaps he simply recognized that the world had changed in ways that made his old style of operation obsolete. Regardless of the reasons, he remained a ghost of the past, present, but no longer threatening. 5 years after his escape from the Mthembu mansion, Thando stood in his foundation's office in Soweto, watching through the window children playing in the community center he had established. Their laughter echoed through the courtyard, sounds of reclaimed innocence, of futures that would no longer be determined by traffickers and predators. Among them was a teenage girl named Amale, rescued from a human trafficking ring 6 months earlier, now smiling for the first time since her family lost her. Ayize arrived shortly after, still wearing his work suit, weariness evident in his eyes but also deep satisfaction. 3 more arrests today, he said, embracing Thando from behind as they both watched the children. Members of a cell operating in Durban. The documents Jabu exposed continue to generate investigations. His voice carried gratitude for that crazy moment that had changed everything. Naledi asked about her grandfather today, Thando said softly, referring to her 4-year-old daughter who was at daycare. What did you say? Ayize asked, a momentary tension tightening her shoulders. I told the truth, that he made bad choices that hurt many people, but that he loved in his own way, and that we learn from others' mistakes so as not to repeat them, Thando replied. It was an answer she had mentally rehearsed for years, preparing for when her daughter would inevitably ask about complicated family roots. Ayize turned her to face him, her hands gently framing her face. You are the bravest person I know, he said, not for the first time, but with renewed conviction. You could have stayed in the safety of ignorance, lived comfortably without questioning, but you chose the difficult path, Thando smiled. That smile he had learned to recognize as a mixture of sadness for what had been lost and gratitude for what had been gained. We made a choice, she corrected. You could have used me only as an informant, maintained a professional distance, but you risked everything for an impossible love. The word love still carried a special weight between them, a constant reminder of how much it had cost, how many obstacles they had overcome. That evening, they had dinner at home with Naledi, the little girl chattering about her day at daycare, completely oblivious to the ghosts that still occasionally haunted her parents. After putting her to bed, Ayize and Thando sat on the balcony of their apartment, now in a better area of Johannesburg that they could afford with combined honest work. Do you regret it? Ayize asked suddenly, watching the city lights flickering like electronic fireflies. Thando didn't need to ask about what specifically. The question encompassed everything. Confronting her father, exposing her family, living without the wealth that had been hers since birth. Not for a second, she replied with absolute conviction. I prefer this life, with bills to pay and real worries, but being in control of my choices, than all the opulence of Sandton as the property of violent men. Ayize pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her hair, silently marveling at how fate worked in mysterious ways. He thought of Naledi, his lost sister whose name lived on through her daughter, and felt that perhaps there was cosmic justice in how everything had unfolded. It didn't bring back the dead, it didn't erase scars, but it offered purpose to pain. News arrived months after Bongani Mthembu had suffered a heart attack in prison. He survived but emerged diminished, finally resembling the 72 years he carried. Zanele, still loyal in ways that defied rational comprehension, visited him weekly, bringing news from the outside world he no longer controlled. It was through her that Bongani learned he had a granddaughter, that Thando had built a meaningful life from the ruins he had left behind. He asked to see a picture of her. Zanele told Thando during one of his monthly visits. Of Naledi. He said he just wanted to see her face once. Thando considered it for a long time, stirring his tea as he processed the request. Finally, he handed Zanele a picture, not of Naledi alone, but of the whole family. Thando, Ayize, and the child between them, all smiling. Give this to him, Thando said. Let him see what real love looks like. Not possession, not transaction, but freely chosen connection. Zanele accepted the photo with tears in his eyes, understanding the magnitude of forgiveness that gesture represented, even if limited. Bongani kept that photo in her cell until the day she died, 3 years later, from another heart failure that this time her body couldn't overcome. Thando didn't cry at her funeral, a minimal turnout of curious onlookers and a few former associates who feared repercussions from not showing up. But she stood over her grave after everyone had left, Ayize silently beside her, her hand firmly in hers. You were my father, but not my tormentor, she said to the fresh grave. You gave me life but tried to imprison me. I chose freedom, and that also means freeing you in my mind. Rest, Unkosi. Your reign is over, but perhaps your soul will find the peace you never allowed yourself in life. These were the last words she would offer Bongani Mthembu, a more generous epitaph than he deserved, but one that Thando needed to pronounce for her own liberation. Years accumulated like layers of sediment, each building upon the previous one. Thando's foundation grew, establishing partnerships with international organizations, rescuing hundreds of children and offering them pathways to dignified lives. Ayize rose to become the National Police Commissioner, appointed by a president who recognized the need for incorruptible leadership in institutions devastated by decades of compromise. Naledi grew up strong and curious, educated about the complexities of family history without excessive glorification or demonization. At age 12, she wrote a school essay about imperfect heroes, describing both a grandfather who chose a dark path and parents who risked everything to find light. Her teacher recommended her for a gifted youth program, recognizing rare emotional maturity in such a young child. On a particular summer afternoon, 10 years after that first meeting at the coffee shop in Newtown, Ayize and Thando returned to the place. The corner still existed, little changed except for new owners and slightly better coffee. They sat at the same table where it had all begun, two people completely transformed by decades of struggle, love, and growth. If you could go back, Ayize said, playing with her coffee cup, and warn yourself about everything that was to come, the danger, the pain, the losses, would you still do it? Thando didn't hesitate. Every second, every impossible choice, because it brought me here, with you, with Naledi, making a real difference. The girl trapped in that mansion was rich but empty. This woman has purpose. Ayize smiled, that rare and devastatingly beautiful smile he reserved only for moments of profound happiness. I came here that day hunting enemies, he admitted, and I found my soulmate in the most unlikely place, the daughter of the man I swore to destroy. The universe has a cruel sense of humor, or a poetic sense of justice, Thando countered. From the greatest hatred and division, love grew. From the ashes of criminal empires, we built something pure. It's almost a fairy tale, except for the real scars we carry. They left the coffee shop hand in hand, merging into the human flow of Johannesburg, a city still grappling with inequality and violence, but also vibrant with hope and resilience. They were just two people among millions, but they proved something fundamental, that individual choices matter, that the courage to challenge destructive traditions can reshape destinies, that true love is not just fairy tale romance, but a revolutionary force capable of toppling empires built on fear. In the South Africa of the future, they helped shape, still imperfect, still struggling, but gradually healing. Thando and Ayize Dlamini have become a living reminder that redemption is possible, that no darkness is permanent, and that sometimes the most dangerous and forbidden love is exactly what the world needs to transform itself. Their stories would be whispered in townships, studied in police academies, celebrated by those they rescued from lives of despair, not as perfect myths, but as flawed humans who chose, repeatedly and against all odds, to do what was right instead of what was easy. And when Naledi eventually asked her mother years later what the secret to a meaningful life was, Thando shared a lesson learned through fire and blood. Freedom is not given, it is earned. Love is not safe, it is courageous. And justice is not a distant abstraction, but a choice we make every day. To choose truth over convenience, humanity over power, light over darkness, always. Those words would echo through future generations of the Dlamini family, a legacy more valuable than any criminal fortune could offer. A legacy of courage, integrity, and love that refused to be imprisoned by the expectations of a broken world, choosing instead to reshape that world into something better, one revolutionary act at a time. The sun dipped over Johannesburg that night, painting the sky in shades of amber and purple, colors that Thando chose to interpret not as an end, but as a promise of a new dawn, for his family, for all those still struggling in darkness, for an entire country slowly learning that futures don't have to repeat the past. That change, however painful, is not only possible but inevitable when courageous people dare to dream beyond their chains. And in that perfect fleeting moment, as they walked home where their daughter awaited them, Thando and Ayize understood that they had triumphed not only against external enemies, but against a destiny that seemed written in stone, proving that even the darkest stories can be rewritten by those brave enough to hold the pen.